The Dynasty update brought a massive overhaul to the combat system and added a ton of new units to the game. But which regions are the best, and which units perform like they were blessed by the gods themselves? I'm gonna give you an in-depth breakdown of all the native units in the game. From someone who's made some poor life choices and spent a bit too many hours in Pharaoh. This video benefits all factions, and the ranks are based off of a lot of different factors like how strong are the units, especially with campaign buffs, how good is the roster alone or when you mix it with another one, and probably one of the most important criteria, how easy is it actually to get to this area on the map. Now that we got the rules out of the way, let's break down the units. Good ol' Elam, the faction I've probably been looking forward to the most, but how good are their units? Don't let Elamite Hillmen fool you. They might look like worthless levies, but they perform pretty good thanks to their lethality and high charge bonus. They can actually do some damage to more expensive units. Amazing flankers, and they can also do pretty fine frontally into some matchups. Heat resistance is situationally nice, and they also have spear base. They're great as mounted backup, and if you're desperate enough, you can even use them as meat shields. Elamite slingers are monstrously good for tier 2. At first look, they're probably nothing special, right? But here's the catch. They have a unique ammo type for the Elamites, heavy shot. This gives your slings monstrous damage and higher lethality at the cost of some range, and they still keep their good firing arc. This lets them put out monstrous DPS for a sling unit, and combined with a shield, it actually lets them outduel equal tier archers and even a little bit better ones. Actually a fantastic unit. Historically, Elam was famous for its archers, but how do they hold up in-game? The archers are your standard cheap killing machines, nothing out of the ordinary, except their unique poison shot. It gives the enemy the envenomed debuff, which drains 15% of their stamina over 5 seconds. This means that a few volleys can turn a unit from fresh to very tired. This comes at the cost of lower damage and lethality. Fatigue is an extremely important stat in Total War, and Poison Shot can actually make or break some fights. If you target dangerous armored units your archers can't kill quick enough, your infantry is gonna have such a better matchup. Elamite defenders have decent armor for tier 2 spears, but there's nothing unique about them, and they have small shields, which makes them a lot worse against missiles. Avoid this unit. Elamite warriors are aggressive cheap axemen. They're pretty fast, so they can actually catch skirmishers and easily get around the enemy's flanks. Low armor and small shields don't really help them against missiles, but they can still be used late game with different campaign buffs when you need to spam a lot of cheap armies. Elamite veteran slingers are a direct upgrade, and their heavy shot is even deadlier. A total of 60 damage. They are murder machines. They can trade very decently with expensive archers, and if you ever plan to touch Elam, do not leave the region without this unit. You'll thank me later. Elamite Vanguard is nothing special, and that's pretty disappointing. Don't get me wrong, they're shock infantry, so they'll always perform good if they can survive to reach the enemy's flanks, but they have low armor and no interesting passive. They are as vanilla as it gets and easily outclassed by a lot of other dedicated shock infantry. Elamite veteran archers are a letdown, and I'ma say it now, this unit needs a balance pass. It's supposed to be a tier 4 archer, and it's a direct upgrade, but it has terrible range and damage for a tier 4. If it drops to tier 3 or gets fixed, it'll be a strong unit as they have pretty good armor for an archer, and poison shot is situationally great. Elamite veterans are pretty decent. A direct upgrade to the warriors, they offer the Mesopotamians faction something they lack. Aggressive, flexible infantry. Stat-wise, they're pretty solid, except their small shields, and the only thing that really holds them back from shining is the lack of an interesting passive. Once again, another vanilla unit. It doesn't mean they're bad though, and for some factions, they're the only option. Veteran Vanguard finally gives a passive to Elamite infantry, and it's just a basic improved flanking attack, but combined with their stats, it turns them into a pretty deadly tier 4 club unit. So what's the verdict here? The slingers are amazing, the archers can be situationally amazing as well, the infantry, it's not bad, but here's the problem. This is on the end of the world, literally. Only a handful of factions will realistically interact with Elam, and guess what? Elam is one of those factions. Babylon wants to get involved here, and Assyria to a lesser extent, but realistically, They're too far away. By the time you get their cooled units, a lot of other archers will easily outscale them. And same goes for the infantry. Unfortunately, this breaks my heart, but Elam has to go into the situational tier. It's time to visit another savage corner of the map. It's Pharaoh's O'Clock. Forest skirmishers are an awesome cheap javelin unit. They're fast, deadly, and they bring an extra edge over most other low tier jabs. They have a shield, which lets them survive a tiny bit longer, and they're actually pretty good in close combat against other low tiers with their sword and shield. Oh, and not to mention that they're dripped out with the finest fur in the Balkans. Thracian Mountaineers are another very efficient low tier unit. The Mountaineers are equipped with the most technologically advanced weapon on the Balkans, a giant stick. They can bring the pain to much more expensive infantry thanks to their charge bonus and lethality, especially when combined with Armor Breaker and its interaction. They're very squishy though, so you ideally want to flank with them, but they're so fast it shouldn't be an issue. They can even run down ranged units without a problem. Mountaineers are also fantastic in forests because of their Strider passive, which makes them immune to the terrain debuff. Plainsmen are a deadly cheap sword. They have much higher defense value than you'd expect from a tier 2, and their offense is actually really good, especially when you combine it with the precursor javelins. They have pretty low armor, but at least they grind well because of their defense, and the medium shield gives them some missile protection. Thracian hunters are your standard cheap and deadly archers. They don't really have anything special going for them. Thracian spearmen are another pretty generic unit. Outside of their awesome equipment, they don't really have any special passive. They're just an all-around very good spear unit. Thracian archers look amazing, but they don't perform as good as they could. They are tier 4, but they have tier 3 range, which is their main weakness, as well as a bit lower missile damage compared to some other tier 4s. They're still deadly, but if you're looking for mid and late game archers, you have a lot better options nearby. Continuing the proud Thracian tradition of being low budget furries, you have the Worshippers of Zalmoxis. This is an extremely efficient shock unit. Good stats across the board means they'll trade very good even against more expensive units, and on top of that they have Furious Charge. This passive reduces enemy morale by 10 when they're frontally charged, so sometimes, depending on the matchup, you don't even have to flank, you just caveman it from the front. They also have Strider, which is pretty great when you're fighting in forests. 10 out of 10 would put a dead animal on my head again. Thracian Guard are amazing spearmen. They can hold really well both in and out of formation thanks to improved flanking defense, but they actually shine on the charge. Because of it, they're one of the most offensive traditional spear units in the game, so if you get bored during city battles, you can actually break formation, charge, and get some kills. Despite being light chariots, Thracian light chariots can't really compare to Eastern chariots at all in speed or combat. They're pathetic. They have Strider though, which is pretty unique, and that makes them the only chariots that can go through forests without a problem. This is massive, and they're great at running down skirmishers and exposed infantry, but expect them to drop dead if something sneezes at them. Thracian chariots have the exact same stat line as Achaean chariots. Their main advantage is being a fairly cheap tier 3 chariot that can still threaten the backline and disorganized infantry. Don't expect them to win or outrun any chariot duel versus Easterners. Thorns of Thrace have devastating damage potential, and they're pretty tanky for a missile chariot, but they have a massive problem. Once again, they're pretty slow for a skirmish chariot. With good micro, they can pretty much take out anything, but they're very easy to catch by other chariots and cavalry from the east. If you own Thrace, you get access to the Mad Mares. Now, if you thought Aegean chariots were pathetically slow, you haven't seen this unit because somehow it's even slower. It has devastating damage potential and Furious Charge, but it's almost cripplingly slow and has a low model count. If the Mad Mares get stuck in bad terrain or get in direct line of fire for skirmishers, you're never gonna financially recover from this. If they get a clean charge off, it's game over. So we've seen the units, and honestly a lot of them are actually pretty decent in their category. The Thracians are god tier when it comes to their drip, and that's undeniable. Just look at the heavy general equipment and the units. But the faction units themselves, here's the problem. Mycenae and the other Greek factions can easily get the same unit types. The Trojans can actually benefit from Mad Mares of Thrace, but look at it this way. There's realistically very few factions on the campaign that will ever interact with this part of the map. Unless for some reason you're willingly settling the Balkans, but as somebody who's, fortunately spent most of his life here, why would you ever do this, bro? Like, seriously, why? Pretty good units, to be honest, but realistically, very situational. This is gonna be one long tier list. I do a lot of educational content on this channel. If you're enjoying this, why not drop a sub? There's a lot more coming. Greece has been one of the most hyped up areas, but how do their units perform? Achaean slingers are your regular, cheap, worthless slingers. Expect them to get killed by anything that sneezes at them, but they can take out low tier archers if you mass fire them. Young spears are dirt cheap anti-large support that also performs pretty good when flanking against infantry. Don't underestimate their defense, they can actually survive more than you expect from a tier 1 shock unit. They can also do pretty good damage frontally against some infantry. They don't have a proper formation, so using them as backline protection against good mounted units is much harder compared to some other spear chargers. Achaean bowmen are pretty tanky for tier 2 archers. They have a similar stat line to other bows, but they have a pretty good 30 armor which lets them win a lot of missile duels. Cheap, deadly, and dripped out with boar tusk helmets. What more do you want? Okay, better units. Achaean spearmen are average low-tier spears. They're not as armored as nearby native roster spears, but they still hold out quite well against similar units. Their phalanx hold formation massively drops their offensive power at the cost of raised defense, but they're already decently hard to kill, so it's not exactly a good trade-off most of the time. They're much more vulnerable to missiles compared to other spearmen, as phalanx formation gives them only a 10% extra block. Island club warriors are an interesting unit. Their killing power is much lower compared to swords, but they're able to tank it out for what it's worth. Armor breaker in combination with lethality is always good, but their lethality, just like all one-handed clubs, is pathetic to begin with, so don't expect them to perform amazing. They have a pretty interesting use though. They have unspottable and they're light infantry, so they're very effective at ambushing. Renowned armored slingers are cheap tier 3 shielded slings. They can actually trade decently against some archers, especially when they're using multi-shot. This reduces their lethality and damage, but they fire out 3 projectiles instead of 1. This lets them do a steady amount of DPS. And they're actually pretty solid in close combat once they're out of ammo. Achaean javelin men are solid light javs. Just like all other javelins, they pack a punch and they can survive a bit under fire because of their medium shields, even if they have low armor. They're also pretty good in close combat once they're out of ammo. For some reason, they're medium instead of light, so it's a lot harder to pull off ambushes with them than you're supposed to, and they're not as fast as some other javelins. Achaean hillmen are, simply put, amazing. One of my favorite units in the game. They are very efficient shock infantry. They're lightly armored and they're lightning fast. They can catch skirmishers like it's a joke, and they can back up any fight in time. Add on top of this improved flanking attack and any campaign buffs, you have a very efficient unit that can see late game use, even on legendary. Achaean runners are an amazing multi-purpose sword unit. They're light and very fast, so they're fantastic at ambushing, chasing down ranged units, and flanking battle lines. But they're also pretty great frontline. They have extremely high defense for their tier, so they can stand toe-to-toe against more expensive swords, though they do suffer when hit because of their low armor. Add precursor javelins to the mix, and you have a fantastic flexible unit. If you own Ithaca, you get access to exemplary ambushers. Now, I'm gonna tell you something. I would sell my organs on the black market to afford this unit. Now, let's ignore that I would die after that. What makes them so good? They throw heavy javelins, so they body anything they touch. But they also have special armor breaker javelins. They lower enemy block chance by 20, their defense by 10, and armor by 15. Do an armor breaker volley, instantly switch to a normal one, and you'll do crazy DPS. Unspottable in Vanguard turns them into the perfect ambushers, if their name wasn't a giveaway already. Fantastic armor for a mid-tier javelin unit combined with Aegean bronzework and a medium shield. This means they do really good in close combat. They can also eat some missile fire. Ithaca is on the far west of the map. Unless you're Greek or Setnachte, you're pretty much never gonna encounter this unit, but if you're playing in the Aegean, trust me, don't leave your islands without this. Shielded spearmen come with a large shield, pretty solid armor and great defense, but overall they could be better for a tier 4 unit. Their phalanx formation doesn't really help them do as good in combat as some other spear formations do, and they can't get 100% missile block chance, unlike some other spears. They're not useless, but if you want to hold cities and counter missiles completely, there are better native spears out there. Gnossian archers, my beloved. This unit is insane. So, they have great range with monstrous damage output and very high armor for archers. Add Aegean bronzework on top of this and they're able to outduel almost any other archer in the game. That also means they gun down anything they open fire on. Getting access to them is very easy. If you're using sea lanes, it's just a few turns of sailing depending on the faction to reach Crete and from there conquer Knossos. This unit is a pure carry in every way possible. Argive Axemen are a very solid tier 4 unit. Good offensive stats and not too bad defense for an Axe unit. Improved flanking defense lets them frontline even though they have pretty average armor. It's an all-around decent unit since a lot of factions actually lack dedicated tier 4 Axemen. Achaean chariots are pretty cheap tier 3 chariots, and that's reflected in their combat stats. They're nowhere near as good as Eastern chariots. They're still mandatory to threaten the enemy's backline and mispositioned infantry. If you own Mycenae and construct a landmark building, you get a Palace Guard. This unit is monstrous in every way possible. They're extremely tanky thanks to their armor and Aegean bronzework, and their killing power is also very high. They can frontally charge a lot of infantry and get away with it, and they're disgusting flankers because of improved flanking attack. If they touch cavalry or chariots, the enemies are dead. Simple as. Immune to psychology is situational, but very useful once it pops. Thanks to sea lanes, reaching Mycenae isn't as much of a problem, and once you do, you have one of the best versatile units in the game. If you control Pteleon, you have the best one-handed club unit in the game. The Vanguards are monstrous tanks. They have Aegean bronzework, improved flanking defense, and steadfast, so they're perfect frontliners. They also have extremely high damage output for a one-handed club unit, and they even have reckless advance if you want even more attack. If you prefer a slow, grinding playstyle, honestly this unit is amazing. So, on a local scale, the Greek roster is amazing. Gnossian archers and exemplary ambushers are a must for any faction on the Greek mainland and Thrace. They're just insane carries. The rest of the roster just amplifies the strengths the Greeks already have and adds some interesting unique flavor units like the Achaean runners. So, once again, on a local scale is amazing, but we're also rating it globally. No one really gets anything unique outside of, let's say, Palace Guard or Vanguard of Pteleon that they can't get in their own lands or nearby. Still, it's very easy to get to Crete thanks to sea lanes, so I can recommend this for any coastal faction, especially Sitnacht, which has a really easy access here. While locally it's amazing, when we're taking a look at it globally, it goes into the good tier. The Zagros brings savage warriors from the highlands and fierce cavalry. All Urartian units have the battle prayer, so it automatically activates at the start of the battle, and for 240 seconds they have 20 bonus morale and 5 extra attack. This is very helpful, but it can also be waited out, so it's a double-edged sword. All the infantry, except the Urartu Guard, is light, so they're capable of ambushing from light grass. Urartu tribesmen are your cheapest infantry option. They have a pretty good stat line for their tier, and if they're fighting while the battle prayer is active, they can trade very efficiently into other levies and even a tiny bit higher tier units. Combine this with Strider and fatigue resistance, this actually lets them perform better than other levy clubs, assuming the battle lasts that long. Urartu hunters are great cheap javelins. Not only do they have good range DPS, they also have fatigue resistance and for some reason armor breaker while using a sword. This actually lets them perform a lot better than you'd think against low tier units in close combat. Urartu archers are your standard tier 3 unit. Low armor, high DPS, and overall good. Urartu defenders are an interesting unit, so they're light and very fast. They can be the perfect backup to any mounted fight as a support, but their charge is not the best. With the battle prayer, they have very respectable attack for spears. They have very low armor, but they have big shields, so combine this with spear wall, they're completely immune to missile fire from the front. This unit has monstrous defense, so they can actually outgrind some sword units in close combat. They're great at frontlining, they're great at ambushing, overall I love this unit. Urartu warriors are a direct upgrade to the tribesmen in every way, so this is the classic one-handed club issue here. They pretty much start falling off around tier 3, but they can grind very effectively with the battle prayer active. They're light infantry, so you can technically ambush equal tier swords and axes and potentially win because of the charge. Cimmerian scouts are the cheapest real cavalry unit in the game. They're pathetic in combat. They're fantastic at running down skirmishers, but they can't stand up to proper infantry or other mounted units. But they are just so smooth to use. Abuse them against skirmishers and rear charge infantry and pray that you get a better cavalry fast. Urartu Guard is just fantastic. So they've got a large shields and spear wall, which means they're immune to missile fire. Their insanely high defense lets them AFK grind that out for a long time. They can even beat equal tier shock infantry in formation as an example. Thanks to the battle prayer, they can actually do some pretty decent damage for a spear unit. Don't sleep on this, seriously. Cimmerian warriors are great. They're lightning fast, so they can easily catch up to missile chariots during charge acceleration or just move across the map and threaten the enemy's backline. They've got a shield, so that's some protection, and they can do great damage to infantry frontally, but smashing from the rear is where it's really at. Horse archers are brutal. No, seriously, I mean it. With proper micro, they'll take out anything in the game. Chariots are free food, and they'll obliterate infantry with good direct shot usage. They perform fantastic after they're out of ammo as well. Keep them microed properly away from archers in good slinger range, and they'll pay you back with the skulls of your enemies. And speaking of skull takers, none do it better than the Cimmerian Elite, a truly monstrous cavalry unit. They obliterate other cavalry and chariots, and they perform fantastic against infantry, both frontally and when rear charging. They even have fear, so it's extremely easy to crush your enemies, see them driven before you, and hear the lamentation of their women. So, what's the situation with the Zagros? They have a very strong early game with their skirmishing units, and infantry is perfectly fine. Their spear units are amazing mid-game and late-game. Seriously, they just perform so well. And the cavalry. By the gods, the cavalry just completely warps the game. Try using cavalry out instead of chariots. It's just a night and day difference how smooth they feel and how good they perform in combat. Horse archers are insanely broken if your micro is good. Once you get Cimmerian Elite, there's nothing that can stop you. Realistically, all factions in the game benefit from these units. The Mesopotamians, Hittites, and Canaanites have the easiest access, but the other factions can also get them too, just be smart about sea lanes and river travel. These units make the game so unfair. Zagros, definitely god tier. Mesopotamia is divided into Mat Ashur and Matamti, but they share most of the rosters with some quirks, so we're gonna count it as one native roster, because they're so close. It ain't much, but it's honest work being a farmer and killing the enemies of the King of the Universe. Akkadian farmers are an amazing cheap unit, even if they might look weak to some. They're dirt cheap, they have a great charge bonus that gets amplified by general buffs and other campaign modifiers, they might have low lethality but they have a respectable attack, defense, and even a minor bonus versus shields. They're fast enough to back up any fight, and if you just want to use them as meat shields, be my guest. Their only downside as a fodder is the fact that they lack the expendable attribute for some reason, but if this is fixed, ignore it. Akkadian archers have a regular stat line, except a bit better armor compared to tier 2 archers, and for some reason they have improved flanking defense. This means they'll survive a few seconds more if they get into combat, but you know, they're still low tier archers, so don't expect too much. Storm Warrior is situationally useful. Akkadian spearmen are a very tanky cheap unit, though unlike some other low tier spears, they don't have a high shield block chance, which means they'll still suffer from missiles and shield wall. Still, they get their job done pretty well. Akkadian militia is a decent sword option. They have steadfast, which is always useful, and they're not too bad in actual combat for tier 2. Their only weakness is the small shield, so they're a bit more susceptible to missiles. Akkadian warriors are monsters. The Kopesh is just a fantastic weapon type, used only by a handful of units in the entire game, and it's just so good. A great balance of base and AP damage, and on top of that, there's a bonus versus shields. They're both deadly and extremely tanky at the same time. I'd always recommend grabbing this unit if you're playing into Mesopotamia or expanding there. With campaign buffs, they scale really good into the late game. Extremely tanky, extremely deadly, and extremely dripped out. Akkadian Axemen are equally amazing and are strong contenders for the best tier 3 axe unit in the game, as so many factions can get access to it. Absolute tanky monsters with great killing potential and scaling. Akkadian Armored Archers are a sore spot on the roster. They're tier 4, but they have mostly tier 3 stats outside of the weapon damage. Babylon and Assyria have much better archers in the same tier. Unfortunately for the minor factions, this is mostly the only option until they expand into Canaan for much better tier 4. Akkadian Hunters are your classic glass cannon cheap javelins. Fast, deadly, and ready to die for the glory of Ashur, what's not to like? Fatigue resistance is always a useful trait, assuming they make it into the late game. Akkadian Skirmishers is where things start getting really spicy for Mat Ashur. An amazing heavy javelin unit for tier 3, with great armor, great damage, and actually viable melee combat once they're out of ammo. Because of their shield, they're a lot tankier than you'd believe. If we ignore the shared cavalry, this is the highlight of the roster. Akkadian clubmen are pretty good at clubs, honestly, but they still suffer the same problem all one-handed clubs do: garbage lethality and killing speed. They still have a purpose, but I'd realistically take Akkadian warriors or axemen any day of the week. Akkadian chargers are weird. On paper, they have the standard tier 3 charger stats, which means they're perfectly fine into anything when flanking, and pretty good frontal trading. But for some reason, they have less manpower, which makes no sense, and a fire while moving passive without even having any precursors. This has to be a bug. If this is fixed, the unit will be perfectly solid, but otherwise, avoid them and get better local chargers. Akkadian Defenders are amazing all-purpose spearmen from Mat Ashur. They have pretty solid charge for a spear unit, so they can do good damage, but they're also fantastic on the defense because of their stats and improved flanking defense. Thanks to large shields, they're completely immune to missile fire and shield wall, and they can outgrind a lot of expensive infantry units as long as they're not flanked. 10 out of 10 would commit Assyrian war crimes again. And now, we're at the point everyone was waiting for: cavalry. Akkadian horsemen are amazing. Cavalry in general is just so smooth and easy to use, and this unit is no exception. It has insane speed, so they can run down skirmishers and chariots without any problems, and they do great damage when rear charging infantry, or even frontally depending on the matchup. Let's ignore that this roster has some other very good units. Cavalry alone makes it worth going here. So, where's Mesopotamia's place here? The Akkadians are fantastic when combined, but individually, if Mat Ashur didn't have cavalry and the amazing javelins, I wouldn't even consider putting it outside of situational. However, both of the rosters have their highlights. They're extremely close. You need to count them as one roster because they share most of the units in a way. Their mid-tier game is amazing both when it comes to infantry and skirmishing. The cavalry is amazing. The only reason this is not god tier is because they lack actual tier 5 hard carries. The Akkadians are going into the great tier. Don't you just love being at the end of the map? Welcome to Nubia, the land of the bow. Nubian recruits are actually pretty good levies. They're fast, they have decent armor and medium shield for their tier, so they can actually survive before they reach the front line. Overall, it's a very solid levy unit. Nubian hunters are dirt cheap and fantastic. They'll die if anything looks at them, but they're not meant to be used as a conventional javelin unit. They have the ambush ability, which turns them unspottable until they're extremely close to the enemy. You can easily sneak them into the enemy's rear and unload your javelins and do crazy damage. Strong vigor is always helpful because we know how much fatigue matters, and clubs can also score you some lucky kills when you're in close combat. It's a high skill cap unit that can actually reward you with a lot more than you invested into it. At tier 1 we have Nubian Bowmen. Archers are always handy, but here's the problem with this unit. Pretty much every faction in the game, except Amen-Mes and Napata, can have better archers very fast. It's not even funny. By the time you actually get to Nubia with other factions, they're not even gonna be worth recruiting for garrisons. Kushite archers are amazing. Great armor, great damage output, and they have a special ability called Blot Out the Sun. They fire 30% faster at the cost of some accuracy and fatigue. These guys will absolutely melt through anything, and I can honestly always recommend them. If you're in the Egyptian court, you can bribe the Viceroy of Kush, and you can get them as mercenary units so you can recruit them anywhere on the map. Kushite Spearmen are a pretty good low-tier spear unit. They can tank for quite a while, they have big shields, which means they're completely immune to missiles when they're in shield wall. That's actually amazing. They can protect your backline and absorb any projectiles the enemy shoots at you. Just like the Kushite archers, you can recruit them anywhere on the map if you're in the Egyptian court and bribe the Viceroy. Nubian clubmen are pretty fine if you rush them, but here's the problem. Clubs tend to fall off around this tier, and there's very few one-handed club units that can actually compete with swords and axes in a frontline purpose. If you sail a bit into Egypt, you can easily get better frontline infantry that can actually kill and hold. Nubian longbowmen were pretty famous in history for their fantastic performance, and they don't disappoint in-game. Longbows have the highest range at 230, and Amenmeth's special Tasseti longbowmen have 240. Even the mid-tier longbows outrange the best of the best archers in the game. This makes them fantastic if you can kite and play around the max range, and if you try hard, the enemy's never gonna reach you. Longbows have a higher reload time compared to regular archers though, so you have to time it perfectly. This is where the roster starts going from decent to insane. Kushite Spearmen are better than recruits in every possible way. And they still have their fantastic shield value, fantastic defense, and that means complete immunity to missiles and formation. Renowned Nubian longbowmen are monsters. This unit alone is just worth sailing down the Nile for. Tremendous damage potential, crazy range, and they're actually pretty good when they're out of ammo too. Use them smart, and your enemies are just never gonna touch you. If you prefer composite bows, you have the renowned Kushite archers, which are absolute murder machines in their own right. Fantastic range, great armor, and Blot Out the Sun ability. They can easily outduel equal tier archers, especially if the others have rapid fire turned on, which will lower their range. They also have a Kopesh, which means they're beasts in close combat. It's a fantastic unit if you're looking for raw damage and flexibility. Back in the day, I put Nubia in the extremely situational tier. Longbows were always great, but it wasn't exactly worth sailing down the Nile for. Now that ranged combat is a lot more viable, that also changes Nubia's spot. They still have the same weakness of no reliable infantry with killing power, but that doesn't matter, your archers are your killing power, and they're just monsters now. Set up way stations strategically, sail down the Nile, get your Nubians, and let them kill your enemies. They jumped from extremely situational to great. Lower Egypt was beyond terrible in the earlier version, but how are they now? All lower Egyptian infantry has bigger unit size, so that means a lot more effective HP, and that also means a lot more models that can actually apply lethality. That does come at the cost of most of their combat stats being absolutely atrocious. All the low tier units have heat resistance, which is great for sweltering weather, and weak vigor, which is terrible because who likes having their units tire faster? Levy clubmen exist just to die for the Pharaoh's will, but hey, because of their model count, maybe they'll score a few lucky hits before they go down. Levy spearmen are in the same boat, but I'm gonna tell you something, the throwing sticks combined with lethality are no joke, you actually might get lucky. Lower militia slingers are pretty good, because of their larger unit size, they have a lot of firepower. They can carry you through early missile fights, and gods forbid you actually flank something with direct shot. Lower Egyptian archers are another amazing early game ranged unit. Their stats might be terrible, but they have a huge unit size. Yeah, once again, don't even think what's gonna happen when you flank with direct shot. Before the update, I hated sword conscripts with a passion. They were just a terrible unit choice that had no killing power because swords were terrible. Now that lethality and stat buffs kicked in, they're actually pretty decent because of their high model count. They can tie up higher tier units, and because of the more models coming into contact with the enemy, they can actually score more lucky hits. The axe conscripts were also pretty bad, but axes were kind of overpowered at the time. The same rules apply though, thanks to the stat changes overall and lethality, they're actually pretty good. Armored lower Egyptian archers are a direct upgrade from the tier 2 unit. They have great armor and a big unit size, so just expect to tear your enemies to shreds. Lower Egyptian spearmen and swordsmen were beyond terrible. Are you sensing a pattern here? No, seriously, you can't imagine how much I hated lower Egyptian units. Now with lethality, I actually love these. The spearmen can tank units for ages. It doesn't matter if they can't kill anything, they're there to hold. The swordsmen can actually effectively blob shock infantry as an example. Before, they would just melt, now they can just grind for days, even if they're not the deadliest unit. They absolutely have their purpose now. Light chariots are fast and pretty deadly, to be honest. Now with lethality, missile chariots can actually shine a little bit more, and they have actual ranged killing power. They're still pathetic if something sneezes at them, so they'll just collapse. Be careful when using them. The medium chariots are actually pretty competent in close combat, and they still do great range damage, so they're just a fantastic flexible unit. You can actually beat dedicated close combat chariots after you shoot them up a bit. Alright, I'm gonna drop the bias. Compared to before, Lower Egypt is actually really nice now. It still has the same problem of offering absolutely nothing late game in comparison to, let's say, Upper Egypt or some other rosters, but they can totally carry you through the early game, and you can even find some use in the tier 3 armored archers by using them as garrison troops. Lower Egypt used to be on the why does it even exist part of the tier list, but now they're actually pretty decent. For quality over quantity, but they did actually get some massive changes with the update. They share the heat resistance trait with Lower Egypt on the weaker units, but that's about it. Militia clubmen are just what you expect. Expendable, they're cheap, and they can't really do much unless they're fighting cheap spears. Laugh all you want about the throwing sticks, but they can actually score you some lucky kills with lethality. Do not underestimate this unit. Militia slingers are your bread and butter, dirt cheap rock throwers. You can focus fire cheap archers with them, but that's the best you're gonna really do. Upper Egyptian archers have the generic tier 2 archer stat line. Cheap, deadly, reliable. Conscripted axemen were really good before in the older version, and they're still insane. Very good offensive stats all across the board, and even though they have low armor, medium shield does give them some form of survivability. They also have the Aspire passive. Now this is very helpful. As long as there's a unit nearby with 60 morale at least, they're gonna have a +2 bonus to attack and defense. This has pretty much permanent uptime as long as your general is around or another elite unit. This is a very efficient cheap unit that actually scales really well into the late game with different campaign buffs. When you just want to pump out cheap armies, look no further. Javelin throwers are another glass cannon. They have low armor, but they do a ton of damage, and when they're out of ammo, their axe really lets them shine. Now here's where the big change kicks in. Before, Upper Egyptian mid and high tier infantry were lower unit size. This really reduced their combat efficiency, even though some of them had fantastic stats. Now, Upper Egyptian spearmen can actually tank for ages in comparison, and Upper Egyptian swordsmen can actually score some kills. These two are still not the best in their respective category, but they are awesome now compared to their previous version. And now we go to good old reliable, renowned archers. They're just amazing. After all, they're Egyptian archers, why wouldn't they be? They have great armor for an archer unit, great range, and amazing firepower. They will just mow down anything in line of sight if you have rapid fire turned on. Not only that, but they have a Kopesh, so they're fantastic in close combat when they're out of ammo. They also have Encourage, which gives units around it a buff to their morale. They're usable at every stage of the game, from the moment you unlock them till the very late game, and they're just peak Egyptian performance. Masax warriors had amazing stats before, but they had the problem of lower unit size. Now they actually have a proper full-sized regiment. This turns them into complete monsters. They have a terrifying stat line, and on top of that they also have precursor javelins. They will just destroy anything they touch. Improved flanking attack is always great, and Encourage is a nice little bonus. Live it, love it, use it. It's amazing. How do you improve on perfection? Oh, I know, by actually buffing a great unit. The Kopesh warriors had the same problem of smaller unit size, but that got fixed and they went from just about god tier to actually god tier. They are such a good flexible unit. Do you want them to hold the line? They have no problem with that because they got improved flanking defense, and encourage helps everyone around them. Do you want them to slaughter the Pharaoh's enemies? The Kopesh is an amazing weapon, and combined with the precursor javelins they actually get to throw in the charge, they can slaughter. Especially if they flank with improved flanking attack. Now that their only weakness got fixed, this is truly an outstanding unit. You can easily match enemy elites with campaign upgrades, and gods forbid if you actually turn to Atonism. The medium chariots are exactly the same as Lower Egypt, so the same rules apply. So now that Upper Egypt had its only weakness removed, Pharaoh bros, it's over, we won. The roster itself is insane, and it fixes any gaps the factions might have in Egypt. They have a great early, great mid, great late, they're just overall great, and I'll even recommend to try them out with non-Egyptian factions as well. Kopesh units are just so nice to use. It's worth spending the extra time sailing down the Nile to conquer at least a territory in Upper Egypt, and if you convert to Atonism, the holy city of Akhetaten is here, and that's a fantastic stronghold. Depending on your playstyle, the god fusion you do can turn your Upper Egyptian units into demigods. Upper Egypt goes comfortably into the god tier. From the deserts of Abernara we have the Arameans. All infantry from this region have Born in the Sand, which makes them unspottable while on sand, but it doesn't give them an immunity to the terrain debuff, which is just weird. They can ambush better in sand, but they still fight just as bad as, let's say, the Thracians that never saw sand. Okay, logic. Alamu nomads are dirt cheap levies that can score a few lucky kills here and there thanks to lethality, but don't expect them to survive against better units or missiles. For some reason, this is probably an oversight, they don't have the expendable attribute, so if they're out, it'll hurt your other units' morale. Aramean tribesmen are some of the cheapest spears in the game, but don't let that fool you, they're actually deceptively tanky with their medium shields and good defense for the tier, though they'll still die without causing pretty much any damage against real infantry. They're good missile bait, and they're actually a pretty fast support unit for mounted combat, but they also don't have expendable for some reason, which is just probably an oversight. Alamu pack camels are dirt cheap and an awesome fun unit. So, they're not made for combat at all, they have a pathetic unit size and they'll melt if anything touches them. This is purely a support unit. They can replenish your ranged unit's ammunition with an active ability as long as you have some ammo left, and they scare horses. A 20 morale debuff is gigantic. Keep them in the backline and only keep them close against chariots and cavalry. Alamu archers have the regular tier 2 stat line, but just like the Elamites, they have access to poison shot. In just a few volleys, they can drain the stamina completely from much more expensive units like, let's say, heavy infantry. A fantastic support option before you switch them to kill mode. Aramean skirmishers are pretty good mid-tier javelins. Once they're out of ammo, they're quite solid in close combat, but other than that, they have no interesting use outside of the occasional desert ambush. Aramean warriors are your standard tier 3 clubmen with a bit higher charge value, so they can actually get a few more kills, but they still suffer from the general low lethality issue of one-handed clubmen. A pretty grindy unit, but you can do better than this. Camel raiders are actually made for combat, and they're fantastic. They're fairly cheap for a mounted unit, they're very fast, and their hit and run mode massively increases their speed, charge speed, and bonus, so they'll demolish any skirmishers. Low and mid-tier chariots and exposed infantry. They also have more health than cavalry. They're one of my favorite units in the game, and for a good reason. They do have weaker combat stats than most cavalry though, so they will most likely require support in a mounted duel. But the morale debuff is monstrous against horses. Alamu raiders are deceptively tanky. They might have medium armor, but because of their defense, they can actually hold a battle line for ages, and they can outgrind a decent amount of units out there. A front line that can actually tank and kill decently fast. Aramean Elite has a pretty good stat line, but once again we run into the one-handed club issue, the pathetic lethality value. They are one of the best one-handed club units in the game though, and because of their stats, they can actually grind for a while. They are an efficient frontline unit, but you have to remember they're not the best killers. They absolutely are tanks though. If you thought regular camels were awesome for their tier, Alamu Heavy Cavalry is absolutely cracked. They're a direct improvement in every way, and on top of that, they have a bow. They will annihilate chariots in mid-tier cav, but they can't directly fight much better cavalry like the Cimmerian Elite without softening them up with arrows or support. Still, this unit is insanely strong if used correctly, and it even might be the only reason you bring this roster depending on your preference. So, what do we think about the Arameans? I'm gonna be honest, most of the roster is just pretty disappointing. You can get much better skirmishers nearby, both archers and javelins. Their tier 4 infantry is pretty good, but here's where they shine. Pack camels are insanely good in sieges, fort battles, just in general. Actual combat camels are monstrously good if you use them properly. Just like cavalry, they can completely warp the game. They're so strong and so smooth to use, but they're not as overbearing as cavalry in combat. Getting here is actually not that hard. They got a pretty central position, so Mesopotamians, Canaanites, and Hittites can easily get them, and even Egyptians once you abuse sea lanes. Combining camels with their higher tier infantry actually does turn them into a good roster, honestly. But they could absolutely be better. The coastline of Canaan has a fantastic strategical position, but are their units worth recruiting? Canaanite recruits are great levies. They got a medium shield and pretty solid armor for their tier, so they can actually survive to reach the front line. They perform pretty fine as you would expect from a levy, but they have the ambush ability. Once activated, they move slower, but the enemy won't see them until they're extremely close, so you can cheese the AI with this. They also have Strider, which is very convenient when you're fighting in tall grass or forest. Rock throwers are your generic slingers, but they also have ambush. That's fantastic for ranged units because you can easily sneak around the enemy's flank, turn on direct fire, and just melt them. Skirmishers are just fantastic. Not only do they have high damage, they have Strider, which is very nice once you're fighting in forest and grass. Ambush also opens a lot of playmaking potential. The main advantage is their access to Spear in the Spokes. This ability will destroy chariots, it's not even funny. They cripple the chariot's movement speed and do monstrous damage to it. I cannot recommend this unit high enough. Seriously, it's just amazing. Shield bearers are defensive monsters. They have very high armor for their tier and a big shield, which means they can actually 100% block missiles and formation. You wanted a cheap immovable wall? Well, you got them. Sellswords are a pretty nice unit. They have good armor for a tier 2 sword, they have javelins and spear in the spokes, so that means they can also murder chariots. Light Syrian archers are your standard tier 3 archers. They're pretty good with low armor but a great damage potential. If you're fighting in Canaan, this will be your core archer unit the moment you unlock them. In the old tier list, I didn't really like veteran swordsmen that much because they weren't effective enough to be worth considering, but now I would say they're one of the best tier 3 swords. Very solid stat line combined with precursor javelins and spear in the spokes. Hello, multi-purpose unit. Armored Syrian archers are another direct upgrade, and they're just a fantastic tier 4 unit. Great armor for archers, great range, and rapid fire makes them murder machines. They're also pretty good in close combat once they're out of ammo. Veteran shield bearers are truly immovable objects now. Extremely high armor and block chance combined with their decent stance and improved flanking defense means they just are fantastic at holding a line. Spear wall makes them immune to missiles, and now that formations are pretty much fixed, they can just easily absorb charge after charge and just never break with enough campaign upgrades. Renowned swordsmen are another great unit from Canaan. Great offensive stats, armor, javelins, and spear in the spokes. What more do you want? They were already pretty good before the update, but now with the combat rework, they actually shine even more. Perfectly usable into the endgame the moment you unlock them. Armored Canaanite chariots are just fantastic mid-tiers. Good speed on top of their good armor and offensive stats means they can do pretty much anything until a spear gets stuck in the wheel. If you want a cheap, effective melee chariot that can actually catch some skirmisher chariots, this is the perfect option. Canaan has a fantastic location, look at it. There is no way your campaign doesn't even touch a part of the coastline, unless you're intentionally avoiding it for some reason. Getting here is extremely easy, it doesn't matter if it's by sea lanes or by land. All factions benefit from Canaanite units, especially the ones with spear in the spokes. And any theoretical roster weakness, like for example the lack of shock infantry, can easily be fixed by nearby rosters. Great in every way possible. It's time to visit Sinai in Rechenu, the home of many ferocious raiders and mercenaries. Abiru militia are a fantastic levy unit. They're cheap, fast, and guess what? They're actually deadly. They'll destroy low tier and armored units, and they can actually do really good against some higher tier units if they're flanking. You can obviously use them as meat shields, right? They're low tier, but they actually have a better purpose. They have Vanguard deployment, so you can easily flank an entire battle line with them or scare enemy ranged units away. Once you use them, you'll love them, trust me. Abiru archers are another dirt cheap unit, but unfortunately they don't have Vanguard like the militia. They're fantastic early game carries with ranged, but they're also pretty good when they're out of ammo because they have an axe. Shasu tribesmen are tier 2 clubs and they can grind through enemies, but here's the problem with clubs in this version right now. Their lethality is way too low for them to actually do fast enough killing. There's plenty of other unit types out there that can both hold and kill. This really does limit their use, but clubs in general, the one-handed versions, are still fine as backup units essentially. I'm gonna sell you on one of the coolest units in the entire game. Do you want to destroy the enemy's backline? Do you want a cheap, reliable shock unit with Vanguard deployment? There's Abiru Raiders for ya. They'll massacre low tier units left and right, and they can actually do fantastic against higher tier units as well when you flank. As an example, I've used them myself on Legendary against the Sea People invasion armies. They scale extremely good into late game with campaign buffs, and Vanguard is just such a useful trait to have. Use them smart and they'll easily carry battles. Shasu archers are amazing. They have a larger than average unit size, so their DPS output is through the roof, and they're also pretty good in melee once they're out of ammo. Abiru skirmishers are another favorite unit of mine. Vanguard deployment makes using these javelins so easy. Position them well and they'll just melt anything they touch. They also have spear in the spokes, which means the enemy can just say goodbye to their chariots. They're actually pretty good in close combat as well. Overall, just an amazing unit. Shasu warriors are a direct upgrade from the tribesmen, but are they actually worth recruiting now? They've got much better armor and they're a very good defensive unit, but we run into the club issue again. One-handed clubs in general just have too little killing power and you can just recruit something that both holds and kills. Renowned Abiru slingers are one of the few high-tier slingers in the game. Decent armor, great close combat stats for a slinger unit, and they have pretty good missile damage. Their multi-shot mode lets them trade fairly efficiently against archers, but here's the problem. Slingers just cannot match the endgame archers right now. I would avoid this unit considering you can get much better Canaanite archers nearby. Abiru mercenaries are awesome. They've got great offensive stats all around, and because of their axe, you can bet they destroy a flank. They're actually not bad at holding the line, but honestly, they're much more suited for ambushing thanks to Vanguard deployment. They also get pocket sand, I'm not even joking. It reduces enemy units' attack and defense by 5 for 15 seconds in a 20-meter radius after you activate it. Did I say pocket sand? Yeah, you love this unit. Armored Canaanite chariots are exactly the same as the main Canaanite roster, deadly and reliable. Getting to Sinai and Rechenu is fairly easy. You got the Sinai coastline, they're gonna have to beat up Ramses and steal his lunch money for that. Inland Canaan is easily accessible for Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The units are great, and if you love an ambushing playstyle, you'll really enjoy using them, and the only reason they're honestly just not in a great tier as a faction is because they can't fully stand on their own. If you combine them with the main Canaanites, this'll be no problem. Still, a very good roster. It's time for the Western Desert. The Libyan units have a unique desert fighter trait, so they're immune to heat and sand terrain debuffs, and they have less penalties during sandstorms. Tier 2 units and above have Sand Scorpion, which makes them hidden during sandstorm right up until they're in the enemy's face. Libu slingers are the standard, generic, dirt cheap slings with Desert Fighter, which gives them situationally better trades than other slings. Before the update, I hated Libu Tribesmen with a passion, but now that Lethality is in, swords have been buffed, and Libu Tribesmen can actually kill other light armored levy units. Medium shields let them survive a few volleys here and there, but remember, they still have pathetic armor. Pretty good at absorbing charges, pretty good at killing levies. Desert Runners are just amazing. They'll destroy any cavalry or chariot engagement they support. Spear Brace can always come in handy, and they actually do amazing against infantry when flanking. Sometimes even frontally, depending on the tier. Higher tier Libu options do perform better against infantry, but if you need a cheap, versatile unit, they're always a good pick. Libu Hunters are cheap, deadly archers. They're pretty squishy, which is a trend for the Libu, but they're actually great when they're out of ammo. The axe lets them score some really nice kills. Libu Raiders are awesome glass cannons. They can crush more expensive infantry when flanking thanks to their stats, and Armor Breaker and Lethality are such a funny interaction. You're probably not gonna believe it, but the throwing sticks are actually pretty nasty with the Lethality added, so you can get a few kills just from the precursors. They're extremely squishy, but use them well and you're gonna love this unit. Desert Skirmishers are great light javelins. They will massacre anything they touch, and once they're out of ammo, their axe lets them perform really good. Following the Libyan trend of basically being clothed in animal skins, they're extremely squishy, so position them careful and watch enemies drop. Tribe Spears have pretty decent defense and attack, but they're not as tanky as other spearmen due to their pathetic armor. But the medium shield at least blocks you some missiles. Compared to Libu Runners, they're actually worse at killing mounted units because they just don't have the same damage output, but they're a fantastic frontline to protect the rest of your tribe. Libu Warriors are another glass cannon in the Libyan roster. Throwing sticks can score you some lucky kills, and Lethality, amazing weapon damage and charge, you know they'll butcher anything they flank. Composite Bowmen are a direct upgrade to Libu Hunters. They're a fantastic DPS machine, but they're extremely squishy due to their armor. But they have Encourage, which really does help the unit morale when your general is not nearby. When it comes to damage, they're a fantastic unit, but there's a lot of other archers nearby that are just as deadly, but a lot tankier. Desert Swords are a great frontline. You might look at their low armor and think they'll just drop like flies, but they're actually fantastic in close combat because of their high defense. Medium shield will let them survive some missile fire, but at the end of the day, they're still essentially naked. The lucky throwing sticks also really help with their killing potential, and Encourage is always nice to have. They perform a lot better than you think. So what's the situation with the Libyans after the update? They're still fantastic, and all their top performer units got even better. But here's the problem. They're still located at a very specific part of the map which only a handful of factions will have access to. And all of these Egyptian factions can get upper Egyptian units which are just monsters throughout the entire game, and they scale much better than the Libu. It's a very situational pick, but I'll be damned if they're not fun. Sea people, my beloved. Where am I even gonna start with this one? In the previous version, they existed in a divine power vacuum of their own, but what's the situation now? Every raiding party needs their own meat shields, and islander spears and seafaring clubmen are no different. Basically your standard throwaway levies, though the spearmen have the honor of being one of the few tier 1 spears. They're still pretty worthless though. Seafaring slings get small shields, and they can actually outduel some lower tier archers, but they're not exactly the most cost efficient unit out there. Aegean Fame Seekers were monstrously broken in the previous patch, and now they got even better, and I'm not joking. First of all, Armor Breaker, Lethality, and the armor system interact in such a crazy way that two-handed clubs are just fantastic, even cheap ones. This passive gives them the same attack value when they're exhausted, and that is actually massive if it gets to the late game in a fight. They scale fantastic for a cheap club unit, you can use them late game with army upgrades. Overall, I highly recommend them. I hated Islander Swordsmen with a passion, and that's a shame because look how dripped out the unit is, but now, because of the combat rework, they're actually a lot better performers than they used to be. They're still not the best swords out there, but they're perfectly fine for their tier. They still have small shields for some reason, even though they use the big models, and they still don't throw javelins on the charge. I'd still avoid them unless your faction is desperate for low-tier swords. Aegean light archers are the same like last patch. Extremely standard, low armor tier 3 archers with massive drip. I just love the sea people aesthetics. Aegean spear chargers were already pretty good in the previous version of the game, now they truly ascended into godhood. Spear chargers in general just feel so good compared to their previous version, which was already fine to begin with. This unit is extremely squishy, but they have monstrous damage output. They will crush any cavalry or chariot fight they join in, they can flank infantry, they can charge infantry head-on depending on the matchup, and they even have javelins, though they don't throw them on the charge, unfortunately. Spear wall is also a nice little bonus. Strider helps them ignore stat debuffs when they're in forest or tall grass, and they have improved flanking attack, which turns them even deadlier. Seriously, I love this unit. Islander heavy axemen are slow-moving mid-tier tanks. They have disgusting armor value and a medium shield, so they're actually quite durable even though they don't have the best defense. They're an axe unit, so actually expect them to get a pretty good number of kills while grinding for ages because of their strong vigor. It takes longer for them to get tired. They're perfectly usable endgame as well with campaign upgrades. Seafaring Javelin Men are a very fun unit to use. Not only do they have high DPS at range, they're also pretty good in close combat when they're out of ammo because of their axe. They have a pretty interesting passive called Catch Your Breath, which makes them regenerate stamina when there's no enemies nearby in melee range. This essentially lets them charge into combat with much better stamina than a regular javelin thrower would. Absolute murder machines. The Dynasty update brought a lot of wild changes, and Marauder Slingers actually benefit a lot from this. In the previous version, this was a fun unit, but they weren't exactly the most cost efficient as, at this point, slings really started getting outscaled by bows. But this is an amazing hybrid unit. They've got a rapid fire, which is pretty much unique to archers, so that means if you combine this with direct shot and get them behind the enemy, they're just gonna massacre them. And speaking of which, this is also a spear charger unit, so they're devastating in close combat. Before, I would never recommend this unit unless you're using it for fun. Now, you can actually give it a try, it's really good. Seafaring Raiders were pretty average before the update, perfectly usable unit, but now they're even better. And they bring Lovely Fear, a flat -8 debuff to enemy morale, and as we've seen in a tips video, it stacks with Flaming Shot and a lot of other modifiers. You can use them to collapse a flank, or they can hold the line, it doesn't matter, they're fun, they're flexible, and they're actually viable now. Marauding Axe Chargers, I'm gonna say it again, they should be banned by the Bronze Age Geneva Convention, without a doubt. This unit is just a pure monster, and it can kill so much. Not only is their damage, lethality, and charge insanely high, they also have the Breakthrough Charges passive. This means they ignore any charge defense or charge reflect, and it doubles the duration of their charge bonus. I don't think I need to say anything more about this unit. Don't just recruit them. Abuse them, do anything you can to get this unit. This is a straight up win condition even in the endgame against elite units with campaign upgrades. You probably noticed the pattern with the Sea People units where they're insanely fun and usually insanely strong. Aegean armor javs are no different. Unlike most other javelins in the game, they're actual walking tanks. They have monstrous armor for a javelin unit, insane damage, and they're really good up close because they're using an axe. Unfortunately, they lack a shield, so their defense is pretty low, but they're still fantastic when you're rear charging or even frontally after they spend their ammo. And on top of that, fatigue resistance, we already know how useful it is. Always recommend this unit if you actually get it on the campaign. If you want a very heavily armored, aggressive spear unit, Aegean Armored Raiders are perfect for that job. They actually have a pretty high charge bonus for a spear unit, so they're great out of formation, but they're also fantastic defenders when they're in spear wall. Roving Kopesh warriors are pretty insane. I already ranked them very high in the previous version, but now they feel even better to use. The Kopesh just feels like an amazing weapon type. They have Furious Charge, so they inflict the flanking -10 debuff to enemy morale when they charge them from the front. We love to use caveman tactics here. This is seriously one of the best non-elite units in the game in my opinion, if you use them correctly. And they have javelins, but here's the problem. They still don't throw them on the charge. This is pretty frustrating, but you just have to micro around this and hopefully it gets changed. Overall, it's an amazing frontline and flanking unit. Aegean armored archers continue their proud Cretan archery tradition far away from home, and I'm gonna tell you, this is another monstrous unit. Look at the armor value for an archer unit, and not only that, they have monstrous range and damage. Anything they touch, it just melts, and they can fight perfectly fine in close combat because of their stats. It doesn't end there, they also have Catcher Breath, which means they're guaranteed to charge into combat with better stamina than their enemies. If your faction doesn't have elite archers, and even if it does have elite archers, trust me, this unit, you're never gonna leave your war camp without this. No, seriously, you should trust me by this point, don't you? Do you want to crush your enemies and see them driven before you— No, wait, I already said this with the Cimmerians, I'm not repeating this. Islander Raiders have one job and one job only. No, they're just gonna kill your enemies. They're one of the best close combat units in the game. They have a great stat line, they're actually fantastic frontliners for an axe because they got improved flanking defense. They even have Armor Breaker as an axe unit. Fatigue resistance means they tire slower, and we just love this unit. Always go on the offense with them and heroic advance after the charge and grind your enemies into dust. Aegean Panoply Spearmen, I dare you to say this 3 times in a row fast, by the way, they're just a nightmare. They have monster stats overall, and combine this with steadfast and improved flank defense, they can just put down AFK in a battle line and just hold it forever. They can even win against some offensive infantry on the charge. But in Spear Wall, my god do they fight hard, and they can even beat shock infantry head on. They're still spearmen, so at the end of the day it takes a while for them to actually kill anything, but they perform great. Renowned Seafaring Raiders are a direct upgrade compared to the tier 3 version in every way possible, and they got even more flexible. They're perfectly fine as line holders, but they're also amazing when they're flanking because of improved flanking attack. They have javelins, but they can't throw them on the charge, which is extremely frustrating, so you have to micro around this. Good old Fear, amazing for shock tactics, and Discipline, so if you lose your general to lethality, a wonderful mechanic, sarcasm by the way, they're not gonna care much. If your faction lacks elite swords, and if you want Fear, which is an amazing battlefield tool, this is a great unit for you. So, what's the situation with the Sea People? Well, as you can see, okay, that was just terrible, I'm stopping the puns right here and there. All of their strong units got even stronger, they haven't lost in power at all. They're still monsters, and every faction in the game absolutely benefits from Sea People units, it's just insane. If you lack elite archers, use the Aegean armored archers. If you need elite infantry, just look at all the options they have. Now, the only annoying thing is getting this, but there are a few solutions. The easiest solution is to build Warrior's Refuge anywhere on the map. It randomly spawns Sea People units, and you can even get higher tier units here at the start of the game. I've had some campaigns where I had, let's say, Aegean armored javelins or marauding axe chargers spawn right in the first 5 turns. If you get this, you can basically consider your campaign over. The other way is to vassalize the new Sea People factions, because they can actually settle now, and this is a fantastic option. Just let them build up some power, and once they have a military building, it's free real estate. You can also get them from some events like, for example, Ambitions or Path of the Marauder units. And you can also use mods. There's a mod as an example which lets you recruit Sea People units after you defeat them in combat, or just enables their recruitment on the map. The only hole in this roster is their lack of mounted units, but that's something that's very easy to fix. It's basically a non-issue. The Sea People remain undisputed in the god tier. Asua brings a lot of units back from Troy. And a lot of them are fun options too, but let's see how they actually hold up. Asuan slingers are your standard dirt cheap slings, but for some reason they are not expendable, so be careful when using them, cause them routing can actually impact the morale of your other units. At least they have a tiny bit more armor than your average low tier slings, but they're still pretty much free kills. Asuan warriors give factions without access to cheap shock units a cost efficient option that can do pretty decent damage even against some higher tier infantry as long as you're flanking. Gotta love lethality and armor breaker. They do have a bit more armor than your average low tier shock unit, but don't expect them to live too long. A Lycian favorite, Eastern Spearmen are amazing tier 2 frontline units. With a monstrous defense value, they can hold out quite a bit against superior infantry and shield wall, and because of their large shields, they get 100% missile block information. They are an insane frontline, but do not expect them to kill much. They will do their job of holding the line though. Asuan archers are pretty standard for tier 2, though they give a very nice option to some factions like the Hittites, which couldn't have access to cheap archers before. And we all know how good cheap archers are. Coastal club fighters are another returning unit from Troy. They can grind pretty decently against other infantry, armor breakers always useful, but realistically clubs have just such low lethality, they're not really worth the trouble, unless you really like a grinding playstyle. Whenever you want to bring clubs, ask yourself this: would you rather bring a unit that can both hold and kill, or something that can just do one of those two? Renowned Trojan Slingers are another fan favorite. So they have decent armor and the shield, so they can tank quite a bit in missile duels, and with spread shot they can trade fairly decently with archers, depending on the tier. Asuan Swordsmen are a pretty decent tier 3 sword. They can trade pretty well against equal tiers for a while thanks to their stat line, but they do have pretty low armor compared to some other equal tier swords. If your faction can't recruit cheap swords, they're the perfect bang for your buck. Lycian armored archers were one of my favorite units in Troy, and they are just amazing in Pharaoh. They have great armor for an archer unit, which lets them outtrade more expensive tier 4 archers when used properly. Fantastic range, great drip, and even defense stance, which is situationally useful. I love this unit. I'm so happy to see it back and actually perform good. Heavy Asuan Spearmen are a direct upgrade to Eastern Spearmen, and they are absolute monsters. Insanely tanky, and because of improved flanking defense, they can just AFK that battle line for days. They also have pretty decent charge for spears, so they can get some kills too. They're amazing in spear wall, they get a complete missile immunity from the front, and they can just hold off wave after wave of infantry. Heavy shock spears are a brutal flex unit. They destroy any mounted unit they touch, while also performing extremely well against infantry, both head-on and when flanking because of improved flanking attack. Their armor is already good, but thanks to Aegean bronze work, they have even higher durability. Spear Brace is also useful when you need to defend against a mounted unit charge. Extremely high damage output and extremely flexible. Oh, and extremely amazing. Anatolian Chariots are pretty bad compared to their eastern counterparts, but they are tier 3, so what else do you expect? They're still mandatory for threatening the enemy's backline, cleaning up skirmishers, and just crashing into the rear. But don't expect him to actually even have a remote chance of winning against proper chariots. If you own Lycia, you get access to Lycian winged chariots, one of my personal favorites from Troy. So here's the problem with this unit. They're not as fast as, let's say, Egyptian archer chariots. They're supposed to be skirmishers, but because of their speed, they can actually be caught by some mid-chariots like, let's say, the Canaanite chariots with charge acceleration. Cavalry will just demolish them. Their range is also pretty pathetic. They need a buff or a tier down because they're just hard to justify in their current state. If the enemy can't threaten them though, they can just shoot around and actually score a pretty nice number of kills. Asuan archer chariots have exactly the same issue. They're supposed to be skirmishers, but they're not as fast as they should be. If anything, they're slower than the winged chariots. This unit is just dead in the water for so many factions. If you control Troy, you get Troy's Chosen from the landmark building. They're just fantastic all around. They have a pretty great stat line, fatigue resistance, and we all know how important stamina is. Improved flanking attack and steadfast let them flex their roles as flankers or frontline depending on your choice. And to make it better or worse, they have a very interesting quirk about them. They are essentially elite berserkers. If Heatless Charger triggers at the right time, they can actually perform extremely well against equal tier units. This just fills so many roster gaps and gives a lot of factions an interesting unit to play around with if you conquer Troy. If you conquer Arzawa, you get access to Arzawan Chargers, so they're devastating tier 5 shock infantry that does so good on the offense because of their precursor javelins and monstrous stats. They're pretty tanky too with their 85 armor, though try to keep them away from other shock clubs or missiles cause we all know what happens there. Fatigue resistance and improved flanking attack help them excel in their designated role. Once again, a truly great landmark unit. So, what's my opinion on Arzawa? It has a fantastic location and a lot of factions, even the original map factions can get access to it pretty easily. You just have to touch a tiny bit of the western Anatolian coastline. Kurunta, as an example, has an extremely easy access to this, and even the Greeks can get it because the islands off of western Anatolia actually count as Asua. The roster is fantastic from early to mid to late game. The units are great and they really have some exceptional ones like the heavy shock spears, Lycian armored archers, and let's not talk about the landmark units. It's actually pretty huge that any faction can get access to extremely heavily armored shock infantry and elite berserkers that can frontline or flank. All you gotta do is conquer the landmark regions. The landmarks, ironically though, are kind of a problem. So regionally, the roster is amazing. It's great, if not god tier. There are just so many units that work fantastically here for all the local factions. But you're not guaranteed to always conquer the city of Troy or Arzawa. If I was biased, I would easily put it god tier because I know how strong the landmark units can be or rushing armored Lycian archers. But as I said, you're not guaranteed to get the landmarks. You can just capture a tiny bit of the coastline and just chill for the relevant normal units. A realistic global ranking is gonna put this at great, especially when you combine it with the other Anatolians. The highlands of Anatolia offer a lot of aggressive infantry and skirmishing options, but how good are they? Before the rework, the Anatolian militia was a strong contender for the worst unit in the game. It's not that it's much different now, but because swords have a decent lethality chance, they can actually kill other levies. If you win the lottery, maybe even a couple of models from a higher tier unit. They went from completely worthless to actually being able to get a couple of kills. Cheap two-handed clubs are just amazing, and the Kashkin tribesmen are no different. They can trade extremely well against more expensive units, and they're pure monsters when they flank. They have a passive unique to the Kashkians, which is Mistwalkers, so during fog, they're hidden right up until they're almost in the enemy's face, so this will situationally let them ambush. Kashkin javelin throwers are dirt cheap. They have a small shield, so that lets them survive a few missile hits here and there, but they're still essentially unarmored. Get them around the enemy's flanks for some devastating damage, and thanks to Mistwalker, if it's actually foggy, they're amazing ambushers. Kashkin axemen are just insane. Are you kinda noticing that I really fanboy these barbarians? They're very good tier 2 axemen that can actually trade very favorably into higher tier units, and with campaign upgrades you can even use them late game when you need to pump out a lot of cheap armies. Mistwalker is always situationally useful. Phrygian spearmen are a cheap frontline if you just want to buy time for the rest of your army. They do have good armor and block chance, but they're not completely immune to missile fire when they're in shield wall, unlike some other nearby spears. Still, they're a pretty solid low tier option. Kashkian spear chargers were already good, but now they became even better. They will murder chariots and cavalry, especially if they charge into spear brace. They do fantastic against infantry, both head-on or flanking, depending on the matchup. If you want flexibility, this is the right unit for you. Phrygian skirmishers are your standard javelins with decent armor and great damage potential, both at range and close. Armored Anatolian spears have great armor, high missile block chance, and because of spear wall, they're basically immune to missiles. They're really extremely efficient tanks. Storm Warrior is very situational, but don't use this unit in sand, mud, or water because they're overburdened. This is gonna destroy their combat stats. Renowned Phrygian javelin throwers are insane. They're pretty tanky for a javelin unit, even though unfortunately they don't have a shield. They have a great damage potential, and they're also fantastic in close combat after they're out of ammo because of their high attack. Absolute murder machines. Kashkin Raiders are just monsters, absolutely. They can steamroll most infantry with a frontal charge, and don't even get me started when you flank with these guys. Improved flanking attack just makes them even deadlier, and Mistwalker gives you the situational fog jump scare. They can comfortably be used against elite infantry with campaign upgrades, just keep them safe from missiles because they have pretty mediocre armor. Heavy Anatolian chariots have crazy damage potential, but they're really slow. You gotta use them carefully because if they get stuck or they get touched by javelins, they're really not gonna have a good time. But they can cause so much pain with good usage, it's crazy. So where are we gonna put the Highlands? It is one of my favorite rosters in the entire game, and to avoid any bias, they are not going into the god tier, we're being neutral here. They have fantastic shock units, they have frontline, their early game is amazing, their mid game is great, and honestly, it does carry over into the late game, but they don't have good long-range missiles, and that's very important. The roster can stand on its own, but it's so much better if you combine it with Asuwa to the west or the lowlands. The location is pretty decent. The Hittites, Trojans, Greeks, and Canaanites have an easy way getting here, and it'll take the Mesopotamians and Egyptians a bit. That's why it's going into the good tier. The Anatolian coast and Isuwa had a lot to offer in the original version. What's the case now? Isuan militia is your generic club levy. They're cheap, they're there to die for your glorious empire, and they might score a few lucky hits here and there. Isuan slingers are generic low-level slings without any real redeeming quality. Lubian spearmen are solid, very respectable armor, tanky. For their price, they definitely do their job. There are better native spears out there though. Luvian swordsmen feel a lot healthier to use now. Before lethality, they couldn't really pack a punch. You'd end up critting yourself if you brought them most of the time. Now, they actually feel quite decent. They're just a very tanky, low-tier sword unit. Hittite archers are very respectable, tanky, tier 3 archers. They trade pretty good against other archers, and they're also fine in close combat after they're out of ammo. Storm Warrior is very situational, and overall, this is a very good tier 3 archer unit. Isuan Axemen were one of the main reasons why you would bring this roster back in the day. They were just really strong for tier 3. They're still really good, but they're not as close to being as overpowered as they were back in the day. Now that missile combat is a lot deadlier, you can really feel the weakness of a small shield. They're still great, but there's a lot more competition in tier 3 now. Armored Anatolian spears are exactly the same like the Highlands, tanky monsters. Armored Hittite skirmishers are actually insane, and they're one of my favorite units in the game. They have monstrous armor for a skirmisher, and they have shields, so good luck shooting them. Their javelins do a ton of damage, and they also have an axe when they get in melee combat. Storm Warrior is a situational help. They will just massacre anything they shoot into, but ideally throw them against elites and they'll pay back their weight in gold. And look at them, they're pretty heavy. Renowned Isuan Axemen are still the same tier 4 monsters they used to be. They're tanky, they're deadly, they can frontline, and they're amazing at flanking because of improved flanking attack. They scale extremely good into the late game, and with campaign buffs they will just massacre anything you put them up against. Armored Anatolian swordsmen were pretty bad back in the day. Sure, their stat line was mostly good, but they didn't really have much killing power. You were always better off just bringing the renowned axemen. Now, the armored Anatolian swords actually perform a lot better than they used to. They can hold extremely well, especially thanks to improved flanking defense, but they're not gonna be as fast in their killing speed. If you want something that can actually kill, you bring the renowned axeman. If you just want to grind, you bring the armored swordsman. Be very careful though, because they're overburdened. The moment they touch sand, mud, or water, yeah, they're not gonna have a good time. The heavy chariots are exactly the same like the Highlands version. Slow and deadly. So, how does Isuwa in Lowlands fare after the update? It has a fantastic location on the map. The Anatolian coastline is very easy to access, and not only that, Eastern Anatolia in general counts as Isuwa. So that means Mesopotamians, Canaanites, Hittites, Trojans, Greeks, and eventually even Egyptians, everyone has access to amazing axes. The roster has a decent early game, a monstrous mid game and late game. It's amazing on its own, and it gets even better when you combine it with elite ranged units or shock. And guess what? They're just around the corner. That makes Isuwa great. Whew. Alright, we finally made it. If you're still here, I respect you. So, you can apply this to any difficulty, any customization setting. You can even use this for head-to-head multiplayer if you want to bully your friends, assuming you have any. I tried to be as non-biased on the rosters as possible, and I really want to know what you think about the placements. This is always going to be updated, especially if there are any patches that noticeably change the unit's performance. Before the update, I would say there were absolutely worthless or massively underpowered rosters. Does anyone remember how much I hated Lower Egypt? But now, I feel everything has its place. Do you like vanilla ice cream? Yeah, sure bro, just go for that Lower Egypt. You wanna spice your campaign up with some unique units? Go to Nubia, recruit the archers, and combine them with Upper Egyptian or Sea People infantry. Wanna beat the game without any counterplay? Let's go Zagros and Sea People elites. Remember, you're always gonna get more value combining the native rosters, and some of them are so conveniently placed, like the Anatolian and Canaanite ones, it would be a shame if you didn't. Or dumb. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you want to see a lot more informative content like this, maybe you're crazy enough to subscribe. There's a lot more coming these days, so stay tuned. And until the next time...